name is Andy Staples and I'm the Director of the Economist Corporate Network for North Asia. We've just completed a series of meetings around the region called the Regional Strategic Forecast. This is where we invite out the chief economists from the intelligence unit twice a year to share the EIU's view of the global economy looking forward over the next 18 months or so. I'm not going to go into any detail about that particular session because my colleague Justin Wood has also posted a summary of that meeting elsewhere on this site. What I do want to do is go into a little bit of detail about how we localise these meetings, and in particular how we localise these meetings here in Tokyo. So this year we were very interested in finding out a little bit more about progress on the Prime Minister Abe's structural reform programme, and we did this in two ways. We had a panel session where we were looking at special economic zones, seen as one of the sort of cornerstones of structural reforms, and a second panel session where we invited in speakers from the IMF and also the OECD to share their views on progress on structural reform. Just going back to special economic zones. Now these were initially introduced last year, and we saw further detail earlier this year in June, and indeed we saw 6 regions or cities identified as special economic zones in Japan. The idea being that within these geographical areas there would be certain deregulation packages that are going to serve to stimulate the economy, to increase productivity and competitiveness and cut through some of the red tape that seems to hold the national economy back. We invited in the chair of the government's working group on special economic zones, Professor Hatter, who gave us a very clear insight into the vision of these zones and how they're going to operate in practice. We also were delighted to welcome in the governor of Kanagawa Prefecture and the vice governor of Osaka. Both of these local politicians shared with us their personal visions for how these zones are going to operate in their areas. In both regions, they're focusing on healthcare and medical devices, pharmaceuticals and so on. In particular, in Kanagawa Prefecture, which receives the second largest amount of foreign direct investment in Japan after Tokyo itself, the governor had a vision there that he shared with us around linking changing demographic structures in Japan with different needs within society and the role that the private sector, particularly the healthcare sector, can play within all of this. The idea is to attract in talent from overseas, research and design institutions, and to really stimulate the local economy through the healthcare sector. There's also a secondary purpose to all of this, i.e. in developing products and services that can be tried out here in Japan and then exported elsewhere. Similarly, the vice governor of Osaka Prefecture was talking about how that region is going to be using or going to be attracting in particularly foreign firms in the healthcare sector. And he went through some very specific detail, particularly their intention to lower the corporate tax rate quite considerably from the national rate, which, as we know, is pretty high on a comparative basis. And also to move towards some kind of reform within the labour markets as well. Now, what we did learn from this session is that proposals come from the grassroots, i.e. from the special economic zones themselves, up to the government's Committee on Special Economic Zones, which is then tasked with liaising with the bureaucracy, the different ministries here that oversees those particular areas of economic activity. The very interesting point, I think, is that once these proposals are accepted by ministries, they then go into the legislative process, and we should see laws being enacted within fairly short order. This amounts to a fairly radical departure for Japan and could actually have quite an impact on the competitiveness of the country. We'll continue to keep our eye on that. The second panel that we had here in Japan, as I mentioned before, we invited in the head of the OECD office and also senior economists from the IMF. And we asked them both to share their thoughts on progress on structural reform and on Abenomics in general. I think there was a general agreement that the economy seems to be on track, although there are, of course, a number of serious challenges that the country still faces. Not least in terms of strong and stable economic growth through consumer demand, and this seems to be fairly weak at the moment. Of course, earlier this year, in April, we had the hike in the sales tax, we had a huge surge of economic activity, and then a huge drop-off in economic activity in the following months. And so really we're still waiting for that to settle out. One of the topics that we looked at as well is whether the government will go ahead with the planned second stage increase of the sales tax from 8% to 10% next October. Now, the Prime Minister will have to make a decision on this towards the end of this year, and so economic data from this period, September, October, November, is going to be crucial in that. A couple of other areas that we covered, one being corporate governance. Now, this again was highlighted by the Abe administration as one of the cornerstones of structural reforms. And in fact, we've seen some quite interesting developments there. And I think the panel was in agreement that should these reforms be fully implemented, it will be tantamount to a fundamental change in how Japanese corporations are run, and crucially, who for. So we looked at changes in corporate governance code, but also in terms of activist shareholders, and encouraging shareholders to be more active and challenging management decisions. Finally, we had a quick look at the labour market, again, one of the key issues here in Japan. And one of the interesting points that came out of that was in the recent cabinet reshuffle, we saw the appointment of Mr. Shiozaki as the Minister for Health, Labour and Welfare. Previously, Mr. Shiozaki was in charge of refocusing the government pension investment fund towards taking a greater stake in equities. And again, this seen as being quite a dramatic change in what was traditionally a very safe and risk-averse investment fund. All eyes then are on Shiozaki as he takes over the reins at the ministry, which has responsibility and oversight over labour regulations. So between these two panels, between the one looking at special economic zones and more generally progress on Abenomics, our audience of members from the Economist Corporate Network were able to get the latest insight and analysis of structural reform within Japan. As I mentioned, this is a meeting that we do twice a year. Our next meeting will be in March, and we're already thinking about what's going to be the key issues for us to be considering there. I look forward to coming back to you with a summary of that meeting next year.